For 8 years, my blood test came back normal. Insulin resistance was running the entire time. That's the myth about insulin resistance, that it appears when your GP tells you it's there. It doesn't. It's a process, a slow, quiet process. And by the time a blood test flags something outside the normal range, that process has been running for a decade or more. I've got 13 years of NHS HbA1c data, 10 tests across 10 years, and when I laid them all out, the deterioration had started in my early 40s, years before any flag. I reversed it in 14 months, but what I want to show you today is the part that came before, because that part is probably more relevant to you than the reversal story is. If your blood tests are coming back normal right now, this is worth understanding. So what does the NHS actually tell us about insulin resistance? The guidance is reasonable. HbA1c below 42, that's normal. Between 42 and 47, that's pre-diabetic, worth watching. Over 48, that's type 2 diabetes, that needs treating. I believe this framing completely. Blood tests normal, process not started. Blood test pre-diabetic, process beginning. It made sense. It's the framework every GP uses. And it's not wrong. It just doesn't tell you the whole story. The thing that threshold doesn't capture is what's happening in the years before the numbers move, outside the range, and that's the part nobody really talks about. Casey Means, she's a doctor, studies metabolic health, looked at the research on where the real risks sit on the HbA1c scale, and what she found stopped me. The lowest all-cause mortality is at HbA1c 5 to 5.4%, not below 5.7, which is where the NHS draws the normal line. People told they have a perfectly normal HbA1c may already be carrying meaningfully elevated risk. The threshold was drawn for clinical management, not for optimal health. That's not a criticism of the NHS, by the way. The threshold exists where it does for practical reasons. GPs are managing risk across millions of patients. But what it means is that normal and no process underway aren't the same thing. And here's why that matters. Jen Stevens, she's written extensively about insulin resistance and fasting, has a classroom image for how the process actually works. Imagine a teacher who yells at the class all the time. Initially, the class respond. It's loud, it's urgent. But after weeks of constant yelling, the class starts to tune it out. The yelling becomes background noise. The teacher has to yell louder to get any reaction at all. That's insulin resistance. Your cells have been hearing the insulin signal so often for so long, they've gradually started ignoring it. And the thing about that process is, it doesn't show on a standard blood test until it's been running for years. That's the myth. Not that the NHS advice is wrong, that a normal result means the process hasn't started. So let me show you what that actually looked like on paper in my case. 13 years of HbA1c data, 10 tests over 10 years, I'll give you the numbers year by year. September 2015, 38. Normal, no flag. October 2016, 40. Still normal, borderline, but normal. July 20, 43.2. Pre-diabetic, first flag. August 2020, recheck 43.2 again, confirmed pre-diabetic. October 22, 47, pre-diabetic, 1 point from the diabetes threshold. December 2023, still pre-diabetic. That's 8 years from first reading to last pre-diabetic reading. And the trajectory was visible in the numbers from the very beginning. Not flat, not random fluctuation, a steady, incremental climb, about 1.2 millimoles per mole per year. Here's what's important about that trajectory. I was under GP supervision throughout. Blood tests were happening, the numbers were being monitored, and during all of that time, I was on medication, statins, alpurinol for gout, asthma inhalers, antihistamines. None of these medications were for blood sugar. The pre-diabetes was being monitored, not medicated, but the monitoring was telling me still normal, then pre-diabetic. It wasn't telling me that the direction of travel had been set years earlier before any threshold was crossed. By 2022, I was 1 point from a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. 1 point. And to be completely clear about what was happening, I wasn't ignoring advice. I wasn't eating terribly by conventional standards. I was a bloke in his late 40s doing broadly what the NHS recommends. Balanced meals, not overindulging significantly. Under GP monitoring for multiple conditions, the problem wasn't that I wasn't trying. The problem was that the framework I was working within couldn't see what was building. I can't tell you when insulin resistance actually started in my body. Could have been in my 30s. What I can tell you is that by the time my HbA1c crossed into pre-diabetic territory in 2020, The process had clearly been running since at least 2015, and the 2015 reading was my first test on record, so it may have been running before that. The point, the numbers were normal right up until they weren't, and nothing in the normal period was signalling what was coming. October 23, I moved doctors from the Isle of Wight back to Yorkshire, and my last prescriptions were October 23. I had some medication left, but I didn't renew when I changed practices. By early 24, I still had some in the cupboard, but I hadn't taken any as of February 24. Now, Boxing Day 23, if you've watched any of the other videos, you'll know the part. I looked in the mirror and decided that something had to change, and that was the beginning. What actually changed was I did a long fast, 10 days, and then in January, ultra-processed food went. The fasting window opened and I moved to 18.6, which actually over the year I averaged 17.7 time-restricted eating. Then tried extended fasting again, another 17 days. The dietary shift came first. Medication wasn't the variable that I changed at the start because I hadn't been taking blood sugar medication in the first place. I was on statins, gout meds and asthma inhalers, all of which I stopped in the middle of February. The core of what I've changed was this: stop giving the insulin signal something to respond to every few hours. If the classroom analogy is right, if the cells stop listening because the signal is too constant, then the answer is to give them periods of quiet. Fasting windows do that. Non-UPF eating reduces the frequency and size of the spikes. That's it. It's not a complex protocol, just two changes consistently applied. The honest version of the first few months, I wasn't testing HbA1c every week. HbA1c is a 3-month average. So the first real data point was the January 2025, 14 months after Boxing Day 2023. January 25, my HbA1c was 40, normal, the first time below 42 in years. April 25, it was 37, down again, lowest in the entire 30-year data set. And November 25, the last test I had, 37 again, sustained. Let me put those next to the before numbers on the trajectory that had been running since 2015. 38, 40, 43.2, 46, 47, rising at roughly 1.2 per year, consistently for 8 years. Off that trajectory, after the dietary and fasting changes, 46, 40, 37, 37. A drop of 9 in 14 months. The deterioration rate over 8 years, plus 1.2 per year. The reversal rate over 14 months, minus 7.7. 16 times faster in reverse than it moved forward. That's something worth sitting with in the numbers. If the process moving in the wrong direction was slow and silent, 1.2, then removing the inputs that were driving it produced a response that was disproportionately fast. The cells hadn't lost their sensitivity permanently. They were waiting for the signal to quiet down. This is where the blood sugar as a long-term investor framing is useful. Any signal HbA1c reading is just one data point. Noise, if you look at it in isolation. The October 22 reading of 47 looks alarming. The January 25 reading of 40 looks reassuring. But neither of them tells the story. The trend across all 10 tests, the direction of travel, the rate of change, what made the line reverse, that's the signal. You need enough readings over enough time to see what's actually happening. What the 13-year dataset shows is a system under steady pressure for nearly a decade, followed by that pressure being removed, followed by the system correcting faster than it deteriorated. My doctor has reviewed these numbers. I can't remember her exact quote. She wasn't expecting what she was looking at, but the reviews in 2025 confirm what the data showed, and the November 25 result of 37, that's NHS confirmed, not me reporting. Over the 18 months from Boxing Day 23 to July 25, I reversed pre-diabetes, came off all my meds, lost over 60 pounds in weight, not through any single dramatic intervention, through consistently changing the inputs, tracking the results and staying in the conversation with my GP. My GP has started looking forward to my blood test almost as much as I do, which probably says something about the state of the NHS, but also about what's possible when you actually change the inputs. 13 years of data, all of it documented here. Subscribe if you want to follow. What my data suggests, and it's one person's data, 10 HbA1c readings over 13 years, is that the process of insulin resistance was running for a long time before any number crossed a clinical threshold, and that when the inputs driving it were removed, the numbers moved in the opposite direction, faster than they'd been deteriorating. In my case, the intervention was two things: a fasting window that gave insulin a sustained break each day, and removing ultra-processed foods from the picture. I imagine that the longer fasts as well had quite a big part to play. I can't separate those variables perfectly. I didn't run a controlled trial, but the before and after are what they are. This is not a case for ignoring your GP or for deciding that normal means something's wrong. If you've already diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, if you're on insulin or metformin, if you have other metabolic conditions, the conversation about changing your eating or fasting pattern is a GP conversation, not a YouTube conversation. If your last HbA1c came back normal and your GP said nothing to worry about, there's probably nothing to worry about. But if you're also noticing things that feel off, if you're wondering about will fasting help insulin resistance or can fasting reverse insulin resistance, and you're not even pre-diabetic yet, this is the part of the video that's most for you. The mechanism doesn't wait for a diagnosis. The underlying process, the way cells gradually stop responding to insulin when the signal is too constant, tends to show up in the data years before a number crosses a threshold. Understanding that mechanism before the clinical conversation happens gives you something to work with earlier, when the change is easier and faster. If you're on any medication, not just blood sugar medication, any medication, and you're thinking about changing how you eat or introducing fasting windows, have that conversation with your GP first. Some medications interact with fasting, some require food. Track your numbers, bring the data. If you want to track your own HbA1c trajectory across time, the way I've done here, the link in the description has the free guide that walks through how to read your blood test results and what to ask your GP about. It's not diagnosis, it's questions. And on this topic, I mean it, not as a throwaway. This is educational content, it's not medical advice. Never stop or change medication without your GP. Never start a fasting pattern without checking it's appropriate for your specific situation.